Alright, hello. Another episode of the Bardic Ramblings going on. I'm being much more informal with these than I am with my game start stuff, because I have a uniform for that, I guess. Whatever. Anyway, like I said last time, I'm gonna take a break on reading poetry, though my doing Edgar Allan Poe let YouTube suggest to me a reading of The Raven by Sir Christopher Lee, which was very nice to hear. I do miss his voice. I should probably rewatch The Last Unicorn because he's amazing in that movie. So, what I am going to be reading for this one is a fan fiction. I'm not sure how much of it I'll be reading, but it is a crossover between the original novels of Sherlock Holmes and the series of video games of Persona. It is called The Adventure of the Velvet Room by NMR3. The summary is Thieves, Murderers, and Moriarty. Where Queen Victoria's finest have failed, Sherlock succeeds. But against a criminal that leaves no physical clues, Sherlock must delve deep into the psyche. Welcome, one and all, to the Velvet Room. Chapter 1. Prologue, The Fool. The Fool in this case being referred to is the tarot card. I'm going to try and mimic Stephen Fry's voices for Watson and Sherlock because that audiobook is excellent. So if you have a spare credit on Audible, get it. It's 63 hours of Sherlock Holmes. Anyways, it is with great reluctance that I consign these papers to the travel-worn and battered tin dispatch box with my name, John H. Watson, M.D., late Indian Army, painted upon the lid, and then said box to the vaults of Cox and Company at Charing Cross. I have, in earlier narratives, made references to multiple cases in which have never been published, which are also contained in that very same box. The reasons for these stories to never see a printing press are many. Some are sealed away because of their involving personages of significant rank of distinction upon whose honor they would inevitably impugn. Some are sealed away because their solution was so simple as to be narratively unsatisfying. I have, after all, some pretensions to literary credentials, and therefore shall not attempt to wring a story of decent length out of events that would span a mere 3 pages. Some final stories are then those which have never been brought to a satisfying solution, and which Holmes has asked me not to bring to light. Even one such as him still has his reputation to consider. No, the narrative which is to follow, which has, as per usual, been reconstructed based on my extensive notes during the year they span, as well as some minor exaggerations of facts which Holmes so disdains, but which are essential to the quality of the prose and the story itself, has been suppressed because in it events occur of such a singular and bizarre nature that even I, having been present from the very beginning, cannot bring myself to believe they occurred. It was the night of January 1st, 1899. Mrs. Hudson had outdone herself in preparing a most excellent feast. The roast was, more than any year, delicious. The stroke of midnight had passed, and I had long past retired to my bedroom. I make no habit of remembering my dreams. More often than I would like to admit, I am plagued by nightmares of that chaotic scene, which I witnessed for a short time at the Battle of my Wand, where I was wounded by that Jezai bullet, a wound that, when the weather is particularly bad, plagues me still. This time, however, my dreams were not a replaying of that most horrible chaos, where men screamed, bullets tore all around, and the air was thick with the stench of cordite and blood. Instead, my dreams were those of a thick fog, so thick as to impede the sight of the surroundings after more than a metre at most. In my dream, a soft light diffused the mist, though which time of day it was I cannot rightly say. I was not wholly awake, yet not fully dreaming. Lost in this fog, my attention moved indelibly to the vehicle riding through it. In fact, the only object which could be seen at all. It was a hansom cab, of the type which are often seen barreling through London. No horse was pulling it, yet its momentum was undeniable. It is now, years later, that I hear of motorized cars which move under their own power. However, the telltale roar of such a motor was immense in its absence. Later, when I mentioned this to Holmes, he offered that perhaps the carriage was still, and it was its surroundings that were moving. Discombobulated as I was by the experience, I did not reject this little joke of his out of hand, as I otherwise would have. My consciousness entered this hansom, in any case, drawn there by some magnetic force. I was, in this dream, no more than a consciousness, less than a soul, more than a mind. Inside the carriage sat a man of an extraordinarily bizarre appearance. It was, somehow, difficult to place him as being of any particular race, except that he was extremely pale, almost an albino, in fact. He was dressed like a wealthy gentleman. His suit, though not in any style I recognized, was wholly black and of a very fine cut. His hands were clad in fine silver gloves, each of his long fingers intertwined, as he sat back in his chair. The most extraordinary thing, however, was his face. He was almost completely bald, except for a shock of white hair at the back of his head. In all the time that I would come to know him, I have never seen him without a wide grin, which did nothing to make him seem more human. These two features, combined with an extremely long nose, made me assume at first that he was wearing a mask, one reminiscent of those wildly excessive Venetian festivals of which one hears only rumours. Yet as he looked straight at me, I saw at once that he was not masked at all. These features, exaggerated though they seemed, were his own. Would that they were the oddest things about him. "Welcome, Dr. Watson," he said, chuckling in what I come to know as that odd way of his. He unfurled his long, graceful fingers and swept his hand across the table which was placed in the middle of the hansom, as if to gesture to the entirety of the cab. "You have found yourself on the edge between mind and matter, I see. My name is Igor, and this peculiar vehicle is called the Velvet Room." Igor regarded me with those masterful eyes of his, still wearing that grotesque grin. "It is the first night of the year, Doctor. An old year has passed, and a new year has begun. Will you allow me to give you a belated gift?" From a valise at his feet he drew a folder such that as a clerk might use, but dyed deep blue and decorated with fine silver filigree. If there was anything else in the valise, I did not know. He laid it open on the table with another flourish of his thin hands, displaying a contract printed upon paper so thin it was nearly transparent. I was about to protest, though I never considered myself superstitious. I was not such a creature of logic that I would sign a deal with anyone who appeared in dreams and spoke in riddles. It had all the elements of a deal with the devil, bizarre as the thought was. But as the remonstrations were about to fall from my lips, he held up a hand, and some instinct held me back from refusing. Igor gestured once more at the contract, and my attention was drawn to its wording. It merely said that during the next year, that is to say 1899, I would be honour bound to do my very best to solve a particular case, the details of which would become apparent during that very same time period. At its bottom, however, was printed elegant lettering, which spelled out my own name to the left, underneath which was left enough space to sign the document. But that is not what caused me consternation. In its right corner was another name, that of Sherlock Holmes. A paradoxical feeling rose within me at once. Relief that, whatever this was, I should not face it alone, anger that my greatest friend should be involved in some sort of diabolical scheme, worry, trust, and more were all warring within me, so that I could neither pick up the pen nor refuse out of hand. Igor regarded me with amusement and no small amount of curiosity. Perhaps you are not ready yet to sign, Dr. Watson. It is no problem, luckily," he said. With another gesture of his hand, the folder within the contract lay slid closed, hiding it from my eyes. I emphasized that oddly. Let me reread that. I'm allowed to, it's my show. With another gesture of his hand, the folder within which the contract lay slid closed. Oh, I see the problem. There's punctuation missing. The folder within which the contract lay slid closed, hiding it from my eyes. Yet even then he did not look away from me. "However, Dr. Watson, I will eventually require an answer from you," Igor said in that drawling voice of his, and then added, "Whether that answer is in the positive or negative sense is up to you, of course. Allow me to offer you a compromise, then. In a scant few moments you shall awaken in your bed at the usual time, well rested. The compromise is as follows. Should you, the next time you see Sherlock Holmes, discuss with him this very contract, then that shall be taken as your assent. Should you not mention it at all, then you shall have refused, and therefore you will have forgotten all about it the very next instant. This at least was agreeable to me, though I had not the slightest inclination to ever mention the matter again. Though I vocalized nothing, Igor nodded. It is agreed, then, he said, and knocked on the trapdoor at the top. I realized suddenly that I had not seen a driver for the hansom as of yet. Looking through the trapdoor, I saw a quick flash of pale blonde hair, a blue uniform, and a face which seemed achingly familiar, but I could make no more sense of the scene before all went white before my eyes, and I finally, blessedly, woke up. It was as Igor had said. I was indeed feeling well rested, and I remembered every single detail of the dream from which I had just awoken, though I did not feel any urge to do so whatsoever. My morning ablutions were perhaps slightly more hurried than normal, as I attempted to put the queer man out of my mind entirely, as well as the odd hansom which seemed to be in motion without anything to move it forward, and with no real destination. I had just come down for breakfast, a full English served by Mrs. Hudson in her usual manner, although, perhaps for the sake of the festivities, she had replaced the usual kippers with Kedgeree. I wished her a Happy New Year and thanked for her service. I had already tucked into the hearty meal when Holmes came down the stairs in a state which it was extremely rare to see him in, that being generally bemused. "Happy New Year, Watson," he said, and seated himself at his usual seat at the table. But interrupting himself in the motion of filling his plate, he turned to me with a queer look upon his face and remarked, in a light and pleasant tone, "Do you know, I just had the oddest dream. Does the velvet room mean anything to you, Watson?" It was a quiet clink of my cutlery falling from my hands in sheer astonishment, the befuddled look I cast at Holmes, my sharp intake of breath, that was a signal with which the adventure of the velvet room officially began. "You've seen it too?" I exclaimed. I had been sure it had been nothing more than an odd dream, perhaps caused by the stress of the impending sale of my practice, or by eating too much of Mrs. Hudson's cooking that night. Astonished as I was by the fact that somehow Holmes and I had seen the same dream, though it was questionable at that point whether it could be called a dream at all, it was a while before I suitably calmed down, recovered the composure of the gentleman society felt me to be, and sat down to my breakfast once more. "But how is this possible, Holmes?" I asked, the Kedgeree laying sadly forgotten on my plate despite Mrs. Hudson's culinary prowess. I admit dreams are not something my medical education covered, but still to think that we would see the same dream, it boggles the mind. "Not quite, Watson," said Holmes. "Among the papers I have read, there are those that suggest that dreams are influenced by what we see during the day. Yet for that to make sense, there should be some inciting incident, something that imprints itself on both of our minds indelibly. And yet here we have not taken a hansom for the better part of the week. Furthermore, I cannot recall anything about ever hearing of this velvet room, and judging by your reaction at breakfast, neither have you." Holmes sat back in his chair. Changed accents for a second there. Holmes sat back in his chair and adopted a thinking pose, resting his chin on his hands. And then there is Igor," he said. "He seems to be a man of some wealth. He is ambidextrous, naturally so, I would venture. He lacks the stiffness of those who have trained themselves to be such. He wore a suit of a fine cut, but no topcoat was to be found anywhere in the hansom, even though the inclement weather outside should merit it. And yet he was perfectly dry. Moreover, the weather last night was exceptionally clear for this time of year. If we should have been taken somewhere, then that would be quite far indeed, and without disturbing our rooms in the slightest." He threw himself back further into his chair and sighed. "I cannot make sense of this Igor," he confessed. "How old is he? By his hair, I would say no less than 60 years of age, but his gloves handily hide the skin of his hands. What is his profession? His valise suggests him to be a clerk, but dresses like a wealthy gentleman of leisure. From where does he originate? He speaks without any accent I have ever heard. His name is Slavic, but phrenologically speaking, he does not seem it in the slightest. I have never before met a more baffling man." He stood up, picked up his Stradivarius, and began to play. A soft, wailing serenade rang out through the apartment, but but it is clear his mind was elsewhere. I too attempted to make sense of the happenings. As was my habit, I made notes of what had occurred so far, though they lacked any sort of coherence. I cannot say that in attempting to make sense of them a year later, I find the notes from those confused first days altogether too useful. A sudden burst of inspiration tore through my thoughts, and I walked to the shelf on the side where Holmes kept his reference books. I pulled one out, the volume which was marked with a V, and began to look through it. Scanning through its alphabetical lists and not sure whether or not I hoped to find some information about the room. "Capital idea, Watson," said Holmes, and abandoning his violin, he moved next to me to pick up another volume. I glanced at it. He was leafing through the entries with an eye, presumably to find some mention of this Igor fellow. Yet neither of us had any success. If this velvet room was indeed something which existed beyond the world of dreams and which, furthermore, was mingling in our affairs, then it seemed this was the first either of us had ever heard of it. I glanced sideways at Holmes, who was at the moment caught in an odd state, completely puzzled, yet delighted over this fresh mystery. At the very least, it seemed an end had come to the drought of cases that was oddly common around these times. I prefer to think this was because the holidays inspired warm feelings in even the most piteous wretch, although I have never put this theory to Holmes. He would no doubt make some disparaging remark about it and about my faith in our species. In any case, our immediate venues of research exhausted, we retired once more to our sitting chairs by the fire. The weather outside by this point had degenerated to the point where snowflakes piling up against the glass obscured our vision of the street below. Not that there was much to see. The snow had effectively brought most of London's cabs to a halt, and it was too cold yet for anyone without some important goal to go for a walk. "Well, Watson," Holmes eventually said to me as we warmed ourselves with a glass of good brandy and settled ourselves to wait for nightfall, "I confess that it has been a long time indeed that I have so looked forward to sleep." And that's about halfway down the page. I've hit 17 minutes. I kind of want to continue, but at the same time, I will let you, if you are interested in the rest of it, because there are 20 chapters written to this so far. Total of 67,000 words. It is unfortunately incomplete and hasn't updated for a little over a year. Still, it is very good. I suggest a reading if you are so inclined, and it is on the website Archive of Our Own, or AO3 for short. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Until the next, live well. Actually, wait, why am I using the end card? I already said that was for another thing. Yeah, so, bye. There should be links and such around.